continuous, unbroken peace of mind in daily living. That's what these talks are about. Unwavering peace of mind is another way of saying it. Or peace of mind regardless of the circumstance that we find ourselves in. And peace of mind comes from our unbroken connection to Source. So unbroken peace of mind comes with unbroken connection to Source. Peace of mind is the absence, the non-arising, the end, you could say, of suffering. So peace of mind is what is there when suffering is erased from the experience. And peace of mind is synonymous with and arises when there is continuous unbroken connection to Source. That's because when there is a recognition of our unbroken connection to Source, there isn't the capacity for us to blame, feel guilt, feel shame, feel pride, or have expectations. Because there is an understanding that whatever is happening through me is because of my connection to Source. Whatever is happening through the other as part of the circumstance is happening because of Source. This is how life is seen when our connection to Source is recognized on a continuous basis. That means Source is living through us. The I am not the doer means I am an instrument through which Source is functioning. So if our connection to Source is recognized continuously, it means our belief in personal doership has dissolved. The belief in personal doership is what obscures and cuts off our recognition of our connection to Source. So, unbroken peace of mind comes with the unbroken recognition of our connection to Source, meaning there is peace of mind because it is understood that everything that is happening according to God's will and not my will or the other's will. And from that perspective, with that attitude, both myself being both the movements of the body and the movements of the other are understood to be the play of consciousness, the unfolding of destiny, much less personal than we can imagine it to be. And from that point of view, even if the other is doing something that hurts us, it is seen or can be seen from the bigger picture perspective that beyond the biological or circumstantial unpleasantness, it is part of a bigger whole that is happening exactly the way it is destined to happen. Happening not because I made it happen or because the other made it happen, but rather because something much bigger than me or you is the Source. This recognition of our connection to Source, the recognition that life is a happening, is much less intellectual and much more about a seeing. Now, the intellectual pointers, the conceptual pointers, and words are essentially intellectual and conceptual. The words are pointers, they're describing life as it can be seen in order hopefully to inspire a shift in a change in how life is seen. And so if one finds oneself believing everything is God's will, without that conviction coming from a changed way of seeing what is happening. Now, the seeing things a particular way is what should inspire the conviction. Oh, everything is happening and is not my doing or the other's doing, but rather the actions that happen through me are part of a flow of life that was inspired and was sourced prior to me. That the body that we can so easily assume to be the source of its actions, the source of its thoughts, the source of its emotions. The body is a consequence of a source before the body. And therefore, the outputs of the body are ultimately bigger than the body. Their source is prior to the body. And this is the attitude of personal doership tends not to be able to see broader, bigger than a certain perspective. And that perspective, the edge that the doership is able to see is the body as the source. And so if we talk about things unfolding because of God's will and not my will, the belief in personal doership that can only see up to a certain horizon, can see the circumstance, and the horizon exists at a certain point, and there's no seeing beyond that horizon, which sort of means the edge is seen to be that horizon. And the first thing inside that horizon, the first thing of that seems to have the power to make things happen is the body. And so if we look at it as an analogy where there is a puppet and then the strings of the puppet controlled by something else, this horizon that I'm saying that the doership can see up to essentially is a horizon that blocks off the strings moving the puppet. And so the puppet is seen, and the puppet is seen to move, and yet there is no capacity to see anything beyond the physical form of the puppet. And so from that point of view, it would be understandable that the puppet is seen to be the doer, the source of its movements. And so from the doership perspective tends to assume the body as an separate, autonomous entity. That means that the body is the source of its decisions. And so if we talk about something happening because of God's will, let's say your destiny being God's will, and someone says, well, I made a decision, for example, to go to university rather than to go out and start working in a job that would pay me much more than when I was at university. And so I had this choice. Do I go and start working in an unqualified job that will deliver me much more money than I've had up to that point in time? Or do I go to university and live on a student's budget for 5 years? And so the person might find themselves thinking about that scenario, and then it becomes the decision is made. Now I want to go to university and be qualified in medicine or in law or in engineering. And so if I was to put forward the proposal that you ended up as an engineer because it was God's will, the thinking from the doership point of view says, but this body, or I, made the decision in 1999 to go to university. And so one of the concepts that is brought in this framework to try and deconstruct that autonomous entity that exists in the mind of the seeker or the person with a strong sense of personal doership. So you might be able to see if you have the imagination of a person with a strong sense of doership, and they say, I decided. And there's probably not much thought gone into who decided, who is this I that decided. And so if you ask them, you go, well, I don't need to think about it. It's me, this physical entity. And so then we look at how much thought has gone into how this physical entity works. How much thought has gone into looking at a decision and understanding where the decision starts and how it happens and whether it is personal or not, or whether it is the consequence of an autonomous volitional entity, or maybe it's a consequence of something different to what is perceived or what is imagined by someone who maybe hasn't given it much thought. And the funny part of all of this is that, generally speaking, humans don't give it much thought. We are here. The sense of being a human is there every moment of the day. And decisions, actions, thoughts happen on a virtually continuous basis. And not much thought has been given to what that process is. Can you actually, this is, and so we could be forgiven that, you or I, just average person, hasn't given it much thought. But then you'd think, okay, the sciences or the clever people out there would have given it thought and said, hey, hang on. It's understandable that through the ordinary course of life you haven't thought about it, but let me tell you this about human thinking. And obviously there's a little bit of that. Take spiritual teachings out of the equation, and let's just go to more mainstream approaches, there will be various understandings out there in the sciences that may suggest that we are less autonomous than we might think. But they don't deliver that information. There isn't a space, essentially, for that information to be delivered in the hard-hitting way that maybe is necessary or would be useful or would be aligned with the gravity of what the topic is. So this notion of the human being functions according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning. That maybe I should, in my talks, I should maybe summarize what I'm going to say before I spend 10 minutes beating around the bush to get to it. But anyway, I don't, because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. It's a happening. So what is the meaning of genes and up-to-date conditioning? Because if we don't consider this concept, and don't dismiss it if possible. I mean, if you do dismiss it, it's because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, what to do. Not your doing. So when I say don't dismiss it, I'm saying it with a grain of salt, which is a hint, maybe. It's the new conditioning that is delivered, new conditioning that might become part of the up-to-date conditioning that says don't dismiss it. But I know I'm not talking to a doer, I'm talking. And that is information coming out. It might be wrong, it might be right. It's new conditioning, or it's conditioning in the moment. And for anyone that is exposed to that conditioning, right, wrong, or indifferent, for anyone who is exposed to it, it is new conditioning. That new doesn't necessarily mean the first time you've heard it. Each moment, whatever conditioning is delivered by life in its various different ways, that is new conditioning. So new doesn't mean unheard of. It just means new in this moment, or in this moment. It didn't exist in a previous moment. In a previous moment, the same concept might have existed. And at that time, that was new conditioning because that was the conditioning in that moment. And in this moment, there is conditioning, which is also considered new conditioning that becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning. And so, when you can look at it when you were 3 and 4 and 2 and 1, and well, it's the same through our whole life, but it might be more easy to see the effect, or not only the effect, but how new conditioning is received and then becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning. If we look at a child that is learning about the world, they're like a sponge absorbing new conditioning moment after moment after moment. And as that sponge gets fuller and fuller, the fullness of the sponge is what we can call up-to-date conditioning, which is the cumulative effect of all of the previous new conditionings. And so the system, the body, the person may have received conditioning in a particular way, and it might even have been assimilated incorrectly. So the mother might have said, I don't know, you shouldn't eat peaches, the skin of the peach. And that new conditioning may have got absorbed by the sponge. And because it got absorbed a certain way, the child might think that the concept, you shouldn't eat let's say actually the concept, the new conditioning was you shouldn't eat the pit, the stone of a peach. And that was absorbed, but instead of it landing exactly as it was intended, the child might have thought it meant skin of the peach. And then at some point when the child is maybe 4, the information comes back in again, new conditioning, the same concept as before, and it can potentially change the up-to-date conditioning. So the up-to-date conditioning at that point maybe had received the new conditioning but got it wrong, and then it can get corrected. And so new conditioning can radically change your up-to-date conditioning. Even if it didn't get it wrong, you could have someone that says, don't eat well, I don't know. You don't have to have processed the information wrong. Someone could say, don't eat apple skin, and you process that the right way, and so you don't eat the apple skin. And then at some point someone says, apple skins are perfectly fine to eat. And that new conditioning, apple skins are perfectly fine, can radically change your up-to-date conditioning, especially the part that is there that says, don't eat apple skins. But it might not. It might be heard, but not incorporated. It might be, we might have this idea that is, I can't eat apple skins, part of our up-to-date conditioning. And someone might say, hey, it's completely fine to eat apple skins. And you might go, oh, yeah. But the other, it might be so strong, you might not even have heard in a way what they've said. It might seem like you've heard it, but unconsciously we can dismiss something without even realizing that we're dismissing it, because it seems so absurd relative to the concept that we have that has been deeply ingrained. And so that is new conditioning being delivered. Someone says, it's perfectly fine to eat apple skins. And it can just, it has become part of our up-to-date conditioning, but it hasn't penetrated and changed our up-to-date conditioning. And the belief that I am the doer is a consequence of our up-to-date conditioning. So the talks here are new conditioning, suggesting we are not the doers. And that could radically change the part of your up-to-date conditioning that is responsible for our suffering, for our disconnection, our feeling of disconnection. Because that assumption that I am an autonomous volitional entity essentially disconnects us from the greater whole. It doesn't actually separate us. We can't be separated from the whole, but it can obscure our appreciation of our connection to the whole. And so this is why non-duality means you are not separate from the whole. There is only the whole. And duality is when duality is the attitude of separation, if that's what duality is referring to. Duality is an attitude of separation, which means we don't see that we are part of a bigger system. And so going back to the example of the person that says, but I made a decision in 1999 to go to university. And so I am now an engineer, not because of destiny, but because I decided to go to university, to study engineering. And so the notion that everything is destiny unfolding just doesn't make sense if the assumption is, but I decided. Now, I'm not saying that a decision didn't happen. I'm saying that the decision was part of destiny. That decision did happen, a decision that said, out of the two options, go off and start working or go and spend another 5 years studying. The two options that presented itself, one of the options was picked. That is a decision or a choice. Now, a decision or choice doesn't mean it is the decision or choice of a volitional, independent, autonomous entity. That is our definition of decision or choice, our definition of decision or choice because of the deeply ingrained belief in personal doership. In fact, our definition of any verb, any doing action, speaking, thinking, eating, sleeping, walking, deciding, choosing. The assumption is, well, if choosing happened, it must be the action of a doer. But in fact, we can, if we look at the definition, we can say a decision happened. And a decision doesn't have to imply a separate autonomous entity. So Facebook makes lots of decisions because it's just programmed to make decisions. And a robot or computer will make decisions according to the parameters that it is programmed with. Now, if the computer looks at the decision, sees the decision and says, and doesn't see anything before that, doesn't understand on what basis the decision is made, it will then say, oh, I decided to show you that advert. The doer. And so if the person sees the advert and goes, oh, that's exactly what I need. This is brilliant. And goes out and buys whatever, the scooter or the computer. And then the computer will go, oh, the doer, look what I did. I showed them the perfect advert. Look how great I am. So now the computer potentially, if it starts to believe in personal doership, can start to feel proud as the doer of the deliverance of the perfect advert. Similarly, if the advert is delivered and then someone buys a scooter, let's say, and then falls off it and hurts themselves, then the computer might feel shame or guilt for delivering an advert that led to this outcome, thinking, I am the doer. It was my fault. Rather than seeing that once that information or that advert is delivered, it becomes part of a sequence of events that could be anything, but it will be one thing. And the one thing is either going to be good, bad, or indifferent. And furthermore, not only is everything after it a consequence because of not just it, but innumerable other things, including, let's say, the person who was on the scooter and had an accident because of a pothole that was in the footpath. So what happened because the council didn't have enough resources to fix the footpath, let's say. And so if the computer says it's my fault, it's not realizing that something is going to happen after that decision. And it could be anything, and it's influenced by a whole lot of factors. And furthermore, the reason that that particular decision was made to send that advert, and then for the consumer to decide to buy that product, that is a consequence that is dictated by many things that came before. Now, these aren't, this is why I like talking about it from a practical point of view, because when we talk about it, that's not to say that I don't like talking about it from an impractical point of view or from an esoteric point of view. But speaking about it from a practical point of view means that there's less potential for criticism. When we talk about it from an esoteric point of view, which is you're not the doer, everything is a happening, and we don't explain it according to everyday dynamics, then it's much more subject to being, one, ridiculed as disconnected from life and some sort of escapism or some sort of fantasy. And it can be misunderstood. And even if it's understood or it's received, accepted, it resonates with someone, then it can easily turn into a belief. So this notion that everything is happening according to God's will, I am not the doer, means that those decisions, the speaking that's happening right now, the feelings that come up that might move me in one direction or another, move the thoughts that come up that will dictate the direction of the content of the talk. All of those are coming from beyond Roger, the one that is aware of what comes out. So there is, at the same time as the speaking happening, there is the component or the aspect, the layer of Roger that is aware of what is happening in the present moment, aware of the room, aware of the body and its inner feelings, its thoughts, and its outer actions. So there is awareness of that. But the one that is aware is also aware that they are not the one doing it, but rather it is happening. It is happening according to the biological complexity, the psychological complexity, if that exists in the system. So the system is made up of what we can call biological and psychological components. And those are all essentially, the biological and psychological are essentially a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So the genes means the physical structure that started off as a sperm and egg and grew essentially like these 3D printers now, they sort of print a structure into existence. And the sperm and the egg essentially grow into a structure that performs, that functions. And if the structure was born and then there was no conditioning that becomes one with that structure, then the biological robot wouldn't be programmed. So the programming comes, the new conditioning is not only what other people tell us, but it's also what is received from the external world. So a lot of our understanding of language and of how to interact with parents aren't because we're instructed by verbal new conditioning, but it is learnt through essentially trial and error and all of the senses and the cognition that puts all of the pieces together. So the very fact that the child is seeing the mother over and over, that is new conditioning. Each moment there is new conditioning that becomes part of the up-to-date conditioning, creates this image of or idea, this understanding of what the mother is and how to what she delivers and how to relate to her, and that is continually in flux and changing based on the new conditioning that comes in. So by and large, it's useful eventually to extend it out and to realize, that seeing a flower is new conditioning. The seeing of it, the sense, the visual seeing, and then any feelings, any thoughts that arise that say, oh, how beautiful. That essentially would be new conditioning. Even the thought that arises is new conditioning because it arises and it is then received by the system that is aware of the thought. And that essentially is telling us it becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning that says life is amazing, let's say. So those that go around looking at flowers and sunsets and thinking it's magnificent and amazing, and maybe looking at things under microscopes or smelling the roses, that is all new conditioning that's forming part of our picture of what the wonder of life, let's say. So eventually we need to see that conditioning is not only conceptual things, but it can help for us to at first look at the new conditioning as being what our parents have told us, what schools and teachers have told us, what religion and politics and society as a whole has told us. And so this belief in personal doership is because society has been telling us that you are the doer and you need to get this and this and this more and more and more to be happy in life. And that if we don't do certain things, or if certain outcomes happen, then we get told we haven't done it well enough. We're not good enough. And so this belief in personal doership, this and the striving for happiness out there, where that becomes what is most important because that's what society has told us. So the body is essentially mechanical, and the thinking is mechanical, influenced by our brain capacity and the information that is delivered to it. And then there is the component of the human being that is awareness, let's say, or not emotion, not thinking, not physical. That, you could say, is the awareness of Source. So Source has become the biological, the mechanical, and that mechanical will function according to its mechanics, according to the dynamics, all of which the dynamics have been essentially dictated by Source. And not only has Source become the mechanical, but Source has also become, or has enlivened the mechanical with the sense of existence and the capacity, the faculty of awareness. So it is then able to become aware of everything that is happening because of Source. So self-realization is essentially Source becoming aware of itself. Awareness becoming aware of itself. See, even though Source has become the mechanical, the physical, it's much more useful for us to focus on Source becoming aware on the Source's consciousness. So we could say that Source has become the material or energy. So we could say Source as molecules and energy, and then Source as consciousness, or Source as awareness. And Source becoming aware of itself happens in a more powerful way, or it's more profound, when Source becomes aware of the consciousness aspect, rather than, but by default, once Source becomes aware of the consciousness aspect, it becomes obvious that any of the physical, what we might call physical objects, are not separate from the awareness, are not actually physical, but are made also of the same consciousness, appearing as physical. Now, we can't come to that conclusion. We can't look at an object and see that the tree is actually made of consciousness unless consciousness has become aware of itself first as that which is aware of the tree. And so from that awakening, the notion of genes and up-to-date conditioning becomes less necessary as an explanation of non-doership, because from an awakening to awareness, aware of everything that is happening within itself. So everything that is happening is contained within awareness, is made of awareness, witnessed by awareness. Then from there it becomes obvious. Life is a happening in the field of awareness. And that what happens appears to be causal, appears to be time-bound, appears to be of the realm of physicality, but is actually all a play of consciousness, a play in consciousness, witnessed by the very consciousness in which it all arises. And so the non-doership can be understood on many levels, can be seen on many levels, and they hopefully will all dovetail into each other, such that there is non-doership from whichever level you look at it. We can see the happening nature of life. And this dropping of the belief in personal doership means the awakening of a connection to Source. It is the falling down of the wall that creates separation. It creates the feeling of separation. Remember, we can't ever become separated from the whole. We are part of the whole, whether we see it or not. It's just that the belief in personal doership creates a sense of separation. So when we feel disconnected, when we feel alone, when we feel despair, that is a result of separation. Not actual separation, but perceived separation. And that perceived separation can dissolve if a focus comes in, a focus that starts appreciating that the speaking is happening. Either we can see it, either the speaking is just spontaneously happening, it wasn't there a moment ago, and now it's there, and then it was here a moment ago, and now it stops. And so if there is a appreciation of the canvas of consciousness, the canvas which is consciousness, then it will become more obvious that everything is arising and dissolving in each moment. Even the things that seem like they're not changing, the chair, if there is a canvas of consciousness, just like the little window of the camera projecting light, and then the film is being ushered through frame after frame after frame after frame. The present moment is that window, and the window remains static, and the images are what change very, very quickly to create the impression of whatever the frames are designed to create the impression of. And so if our awareness has come into the present moment, meaning come into this experience of life, and started to remain grounded and seen to not move, awareness doesn't move, and yet what moves is the sounds, the sights, all of the sensations, including the thoughts and the emotions and the physical sensations of the body. So if we can start to see the present moment as essentially a canvas, or rather content, the present moment is content, ever-changing content on an unchanging canvas. And we are the canvas, what becomes aware of the present moment, meaning present moment means the life experience that is here now, the room, the appearance of the room you are in, is the content on the canvas of consciousness. And the fact that it feels like a three-dimensional room is because the content is designed to create that impression. So the content in this life experience we have is content designed to create the impression of time and space. Time and space in which three-dimensional physicality exists. And within that three-dimensional physicality stage, a body is inserted in that as part of that content. So the body is as much an appearance as the rest of the appearance of time and space. And the body is the portal through which consciousness can function. And consciousness can function through the body and can also zoom out and become aware of the present moment as this canvas. So consciousness is able to assume different positions, not because of its free will, but because the position that consciousness assumes, being expanded container-like perspective, or a perspective coming through the body, aware of the world from the point of the body, that is subject to change. And that too is a consequence of the destined, of a consequence of what we can say destiny, which means how the present moment is designed to appear. And if it's destined to appear in a way where there is an appreciation that each moment is always just content on the screen of consciousness, the present moment screen, that is, remember, like the window in the cinema projector, and that anything that happened in the past was just a frame that was passing through the window of the present moment, and it doesn't exist anymore and is now replaced by the content of this moment, which is, as soon as it arises, the content arises, it dies and gives way to the next content. Now, if that's appreciated, that's meditation. These shifts, these different perspectives I'm talking about, the non-doership essentially, is what reveals a deeper aspect of ourself, an aspect of ourself that is already complete, doesn't need things from the other or from outside to know its completeness, to know its self-contentedness. And that aspect of ourself is self-confirming, and the nature of itself as peace and contentment is self-evident when it reveals itself, when there is a grounding and a resting in it. And the flip-flopping that happens is us getting dragged out of that place where there is a sense of separation, a certain type of thinking comes in, outcomes feel much more important. The other seems to be the one that makes the outcome happen or not happen, or the outcome happens well or not well because of what I did and I should have done it differently. And then we have this whole heaviness and constriction where we are very centered in the body as the doer. And that is where the sense of separation, the sense of uncomfortableness and disconnection is experienced, which you could say is the human condition. That is what has become the default. So the default process of this life is to have experience of life that includes the sense of I am the person, I am the body, with no appreciation of the consciousness functioning through the body, no appreciation that life is not as it appears, and so there is only a relationship to life as if it is physicality, and that is it. That is something that is very changeable, not by you or me, but by destiny. And if you're listening to this talk, it means that you're listening to the talk not because you have destined that to be the case because of the decision to turn on your computer, but rather destiny has destined it to be the case and has included a computer and a thought that says, let me turn on the computer to watch satsang. And so if that's happened, then Ramesh used to say, no need to be pessimistic when the statement says it's not you or I that can change our perspective of life, but it's up to destiny. Ramesh would say, no need to be pessimistic that it's up to destiny, because it appears that destiny is already doing its job. Or when I say doing its job, that it seems like destiny is laying out the foundations for a story that is a story of seeing life differently. Because destiny has created a story of cause and effect, which means things don't just happen randomly with no explanation. We don't have oak trees in life just spontaneously appearing in this moment. I don't think that that is impossible in maybe in a different world where the rules of engagement are different. It wouldn't entirely surprise me. I'd be a little surprised because it's not in line with how this manifestation, the rules of this manifestation, but it's not outside the rule, the overall rules, because the overall rules is life is a manifestation. Now, this manifestation just appears to manifest according to laws of cause and effect and time. So your house, you wake up in your house and it appears that the house was built 15 years ago and you remember when it was being built, or when you bought it. So is it really that the house was built 15 years ago? Or maybe are we awakening into a dream in this moment of the house being here, and thoughts and memories that say it was built 15 years ago, and on the bookshelf there is an album that seems to confirm that it was built 15 years ago because it has pictures of the house being built, etc., etc. But so that's how this manifestation turns out. It is according to rules of cause and effect. But could an oak tree in principle just appear in front of us? Not there one there the next. Or for that matter, an apple floating past. As I say, it wouldn't completely surprise me. It would surprise me a little bit, a lot, but not to the point where I'd say I have absolutely no explanation for this. I would say, oh, it seems like the manifestation's rules are changing. This is going to get tongues wagging. This is going to get people thinking. Oh, look, lots of hands up. I will take the opportunity to go into questions and answers. Oh, before I do, just to mention the two upcoming events. One's not that upcoming, and that is that the 3-week retreat is sort of scheduled. I haven't put any information up yet, but given the West Australian borders are now open, assuming they don't close down again, we can have another 3-week retreat, which is 2.5 years late, essentially. And that is set for the 24th of October, Monday, I think. There's only about 5 spots left on that, so if anyone's interested, send me an email so that I can put you down on the list. I think the information for the previous one is still up on the website, and everything's going to remain more or less the same as that. And then at the end of April, around the 24th of April, 26th maybe, a Monday also, there is the next intensive, and that is on integration and critical thinking, and how critical thinking applies within the context of freedom from suffering. So an example of that is, that if we go around saying it's all God's will and then we ride around without a motorcycle helmet on, for example, thinking, oh, well, if I'm going to have a crash and brain injury, well, that's going to happen. That may be where we've understood everything's happening according to God's will, but our critical thinking hasn't kicked in to the point where we can then rationalize and say, well, maybe it's God's will for me to wear a helmet. And then if there is an accident, maybe it's God's will for me not to have a brain injury. And so there are often a lot of insights that happen that are a bit one-sided. And so critical thinking is the integration of the unseen, that which hasn't been previously seen, and integrating it into practical daily living. Now, critical thinking is not entirely necessary, because as it isn't a critical thinking that delivers freedom, because our freedom is not because of thinking. But there is, so you could have someone that goes around thinking it's all God's will and therefore I won't lock the door or I won't wear a helmet when I'm riding. And they can have freedom of suffering, freedom from suffering, even without that faculty of critical thought. But it's worth mentioning. And anyway, the main part of the intensive is always going to be around non-doership. So the integration and critical thinking just gets woven in to that. So Cynthia, I think, is first. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, Roger.
Hi there.
Thank you for sharing your teaching. Today is perfect for me. I've just come back from visiting my parents who are elderly, and though I'd like to say most of the time I live my life in presence and non-dual thinking and showing up, I feel like I've arrived home in a total flip-flop and feeling like I didn't do the right thing, they didn't do the right thing, and I just need some guidance of how to quiet that side of me. The content of the situation is a step-parent that I feel is withholding medical information regarding my father, who has Alzheimer's. And during COVID, I haven't been able to go to visit. And so this is my first visit in a year, and I see that his mental health and physical health has declined. And she read a letter to me from the doctor that indicated that he's at this particular stage of Alzheimer's, that he should not be driving his car. And then said to me, and I don't want you to tell him this, and he doesn't know any of this, and I'm not ready for my life to change and for him not to drive anymore, so I will deal with this the way that I want to deal with this. And I was aware of my personal reaction. I was aware of the little girl reaction. I was aware of the adult in me who also works in the medical field that wanted to go into action and take over. And instead I said, okay, this is a lot of information. I'm going to take a little bit of time. And I went for a walk. And when I came back, I felt more ready just to listen and show up. And she had totally shut down. And she said, I'm not discussing this with you. I already see that you're trying to take it over and you think that you know more than me. And we ended up not having a further conversation. So now I've left and I'm 3,000 miles away again. And I wrote her a letter and asked if I could be a part of the medical team or talk to the doctors. And she said at this time that she would find it more of an irritant if I were involved. And I'm having a hard time being with that. I don't know what to do with it.
It's an interesting scenario. The whole thing has already happened is one way of looking at it. So that includes how you go forward from here, and also up to this point and any consequences. It's all happened. So when you stand back and think about it from here, you say, well, I could enforce my desire to ensure that he is being guided by the professional recommendations, or I could come to some other rationalization that says, well, even though there are the professional recommendations, she is, let's say, the one who's going to be caring for him, maybe not. And so you might rationalize not that the professional recommendation, even though it might be what you would like, might not be what serves best given her standpoint. So there's a vast, and anything in between is the approach you could take. And whichever approach you take, and whatever the outcome is, good, bad, or indifferent, because either way, you could say, well, I think it's best for everyone involved if I don't create a conflict between me and her. And then that might lead to an unfortunate circumstance in relation to the driving, let's say. Or you say, I'm going to do something about this, and you get the authorities involved, let's say, and that leads to an unfortunate circumstance. The thing is, we don't know what the outcome is. We might imagine an outcome and think, because when we make a decision, we tend to, that's what we will make a decision based on, and that's fine. We have to. That's how our decision process works. But we have to understand. But ultimately, the outcome is not in our control, and so our decision and the outcomes will happen one way. So you could say they've already happened. So I don't really have a this is what you should do, but attitudinally, whatever it is that you do, whatever it is that she does, it's worth keeping an eye on the responses, the reactions that come up, and see which ones of those are suffering responses, understanding that if suffering comes up, it is because of seeing oneself and the other as the doer, and therefore, blaming her and insisting on your expectation being met and how you want life to unfold being met. So it's not really about between how she wants life to unfold or how you want life to unfold. But rather seeing actually it is all bigger than what I want or what she wants, but rather it is destiny unfolding. And destiny unfolding will either unfold according to, let's say, her directive, or according to your directive, but it doesn't unfold because of her directive or because of your directive as a doer, but rather you and her are instruments for life to unfold as it is destined to unfold. So if you can keep an eye on the different forms of suffering, and whenever they come up, I would say there's a better way, which doesn't mean it can happen, but it seems to me, based on how you described it, is you did center yourself several times, and as opposed to just diving in and fighting it out.
No, it wasn't an all-out disaster, but there was a definite moment when I was aware that I was reacting, and I kind of pulled myself back in and was present and hearing her words. And a mantra that helps me is I just say in my head, I'm a tree. And when I say I'm a tree, I immediately go grounded, I go rooted, I'm present, I can bend. Uh, and in some ways, it was more of a judgment of myself that I feel in so many ways I don't have a reaction. And this, it surprised me how quickly it bubbled up to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And I had one more day that I was there, and I just chose to drop it and be present. And I didn't know if there was something that I could do with it. So I just let life continue to unfold while I was there. And I still don't know if there's something to do. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
being with it,
Mm.
calling them up, giving them my love, offering my help. And the process, I think, for me is to what you're talking about, Roger, just allowing destiny to unfold, even though in some ways my jaw is dropping wide open, like, what the fuck? This is how destiny's unfolding at this point? Like, I don't want it to unfold this way.
Yeah, don't let that attitude debilitate your biological movement from being, because that's if it does debilitate a certain biological action, even that is destiny, right? But that is one of the in a way non-integrated parts of the understanding where we are so focused on allowing things to be as they are and witnessing things that in a way that insistence or that movement, which is a, a practice that needs to happen for a certain period of time, but that can stop us from functioning biologically as well. Ironically, it sort of disables not only the reaction, but it will disable the biological response. And at some point, we'll realize it, often because we're not respecting other people's boundaries, or not respecting our boundaries, and allowing things to come in because we're just witnessing it. And a response in us has also been disabled to set certain boundaries. And at some point, we'll realize that this is what's happened, and then that aspect gets re-enabled, hopefully without the involvement, the attitudinal involvement kicking back in. And so if you feel strongly, let's say, to write a letter to his doctor and say, look, this is what's happening, and I don't really know. And so what I'm doing is I'm writing a letter to you. Now that's something that we may not do because let me just allow it to unfold. Now, that's valid because if we do just let it unfold and we don't write that letter, because maybe we might not think it's possible to write the letter, or that if I write the letter, that's not me allowing it to unfold. If that happens, that's destiny, that's life unfolding according to destiny. But if you do write the letter, that's destiny as well. So, yeah, don't necessarily feel you're completely disarmed as part of this witnessing and letting things happen. Allow the body to function biologically and see that as what is happening. Mm-hmm. There's a great value, I think, in even if someone is sort of technically wrong. I know someone who had a medical procedure, and it was suggested that they don't eat certain things, and yet they, eat a lot of the things that is suggested that they don't. Now, so technically, they're wrong relative to the health advice and what is probably good for them. And yet, we can't let the fact that someone is technically wrong mean that we have the right to control their life. So, in this situation, it's a bit hard because you've got a carer. It's someone in between. There's a middle person in between, right? But what I mean is, let's say there isn't this person that I know is eating a whole lot of food, and so they're technically wrong. But that doesn't mean I can then go and force my will onto them and say,
Right.
You should. So it's fine for me to say, hey, that really isn't the diet that's recommended. But as soon as it starts to become a conflict, my view is back off, because it's their life, in a way. But that doesn't mean no conflicts at all, because if someone's building something onto my property, and then I say, hey, do you realize you're 1 meter into my fence line? And then they start shouting in conflict. That doesn't mean that I go, conflict, back off, and let them build 1 meter into my fence line, because that's my fence line, whereas that's his life, right? So the food, eating, the decisions that they make about driving or whatever, if he's making those decisions, then you put your input in and then leave the rest up to destiny.
Yeah.
But in this case, her decisions for your father might be like someone building their property 1 meter into my fence line.
Yes.
It could be the equivalent of that. So the final conclusion is, in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do, knowing that is destiny creating that feeling and that action, and then leave the outcome up to God.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Cynthia. Hi, Cecilia.
Hi, Roger.
Hi.
Hi. So nice to see you. Thank you again.
Nice to see you.
Okay, so I have discovered something about myself, and it kind of has thrown me off a little bit, and I'm not sure how to deal with it all, because I'm in a situation where I rent. I'm going to make this a little bit personal today so I can address my question to you. I rent, and this landlord of mine vacillates between wanting to sell and not wanting to sell. So I'm in a kind of an unstable situation in terms of my, living arrangements. And when last time he told me, I panicked. I realized that I panicked. Everything that I thought that I was accomplishing in terms of greater awareness kind of seemed to have flown out the window. And then I went and offered to buy a place that I don't really want to buy at all. And luckily, I managed to get myself out of it. But in spite of everything that I did, centering myself and knowing everything that I know, I lived until it was resolved. Like those 10 days were agony. Like I had no peace of mind. So, and I thought, oh my God, like I am totally unenlightened. Like everything that I thought that I had accomplished, I have not accomplished at all, because I suddenly realized that peace of mind, you can have peace of mind when everything is okay in life. But when things go wrong, it's like it's a completely different ball game, right? And even now, like, okay, well, I dodged that bullet, so I'm not quite sure what was happening there. Like my decision, was it destiny unfolding? And then my getting out of this, was it just my being precipitous and precisely engaging in the kind of doership that I should not be engaging in? Do you understand? So it's like I'm confused, and now it's like I don't know what to do about this particular situation anymore. I don't know if I should go out and look for another place to live, if I should just let everything unfold, and when it unfolds, then whatever comes up to be done at that time will be done at that time. Do you understand? So it's like I'm really confused. And then I have another question about something else, if I may, as well. So please help me, because I just like I feel like I'm kind of lost at the moment. I'm in a little bit of a desert.
Yeah. Well, the whole thing to me is destiny. There is only destiny. Even when someone has the response and the attitude of doership, that too is destiny. It's not that when that attitude kicks in, destiny is suspended, and then we've reverted to doership, and the doer has somehow, superseded destiny and is now imposing their will and therefore controlling outcomes and whatever. Regardless of what attitude is there, it's all destiny, and including the attitude is destiny. So what destiny has shown is that when times start to deliver some pain, when circumstance is painful, which was shown by that particular
Alexa, stop.
Movement of the landlord, that just showed, the doership was the attachment to outcome, and a certain movement was inspired as a result of that circumstance. So you got to see that, and the outcome being an outcome that happened to be positive was part of destiny. So you could say that it was a lucky or a favorable, a fortunate destiny that showed you this, that there's still some remnants in there of attachment. And it's not unusual, is that it's good to see, because continuous unbroken peace of mind regardless of circumstance, when things are good, we can feel like, oh yeah, I'm completely grounded and there's peace of mind, there's no involvement. And then, as you say, as soon as something goes and there's a bit of a pain, unfortunate circumstance, that understanding gets thrown out the window essentially, and we see this other movement. And so it's an opportunity for us to see what is being triggered. And essentially, I think it's the belief my happiness is to be found in outcomes. Because essentially what that circumstance said is your living arrangements that you're probably quite comfortable with, maybe the rent is good, maybe the house is sweet, the location is ideal, and suddenly it's like, oh, you're going to take all of this away from me. Your decision to sell is going to take away this ideal set of circumstances. And so then that inspires us to get into a panic one way or another. And so in terms of what you should do, I think, once again, I don't know what destiny is. So when I put forward these suggestions, they're with a grain of salt. But it sounds like you're in a relatively fortunate position in that you can buy a property. It might not be the best, your favored option, because at the moment you're obviously choosing to.
I'm not actually. I'm not. That's what kind of made me think afterwards, like, what the hell happened to me that I even entertained this idea? Because I'm not.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Well, so don't go and buy a property, because you're not in a position to buy a property. So that takes that off the table. And yeah, either wait for a definitive decision for the landlord, which may never come, because he may spend, another 2 years thinking about it, not being certain, and it might never eventuate, or preempt it and say, at some point, the likelihood is he's going to say it's up for sale, and then that's going to mean I'm going to be under more pressure to do everything within a certain time frame. So you might say, okay, let me look for another rental, and even though I don't have to leave, I'm going to start looking, and if I find something I like that's the right budget and all of that, then I'll swap leases, and you then just move from one to the other without the pressure. So I think your decision making is quite simplified by, one, the fact that you realize that you're not in an ideal position to buy, and it will put you under a lot of pressure, and et cetera, et cetera. So that gets wiped off the table. Now you're left with renting. You either stay where you are until you're forced to move, which may never happen. So I would say, well, start looking, and if you find something better, move. And if you don't find something better, hope that he never decides to sell, knowing that if he does decide to sell, then your hand is forced.
So, but like my attitude towards it, so that I can have some peace of mind or dwell in this peace of mind, is basically that. For me, it's just like, okay, I'm living the present moment.
Well, no, the attitude.
But I don't know. Yeah.
I would say your attitude is that circumstance is not what determines your wholeness, your existence. Your existence is not determined by whether your landlord says he's going to sell the property or not. And if we lose ourselves in that being a determining factor of whether I'm okay, then essentially we become, our existence is a very fragile thing that is pinned on all of these very variable things in life. So part of the notion my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes is unpinning our happiness from an outcome-driven belief in happiness, which is never where it's to be found. Seeing that the outcomes are just either they're inconvenient or they're painful, they're not good, but turning inwards and finding a place where you can return to, and even in the face of your landlord making a decision that you don't like, come back and go, it's okay, I'm still here. And I haven't ceased to exist because he delivered this information to me. And you come back and reground and realize I've had to face unfortunate circumstances many times in my life, and eventually it's water under the bridge. It might mean that you have to pack up and you have to search for a house and you have to do things you'd rather not do, but one foot forward at a time, and you'll survive.
Okay. All right. So my other thing is this: that somewhere I think I read Nisargadatta wrote something about the importance of making friends with solitude.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I read that from him. I think so. And I'd like, I don't know if you could expand a little bit on that, because I'm finding more and more that I'm sort of torn between these two movements. Like, I have people who invite me to go along with them, and it sounds like a great idea. And then I get there, and then after a while, I'm totally bored and sitting there thinking, what the heck am I doing with these people? Like, but then again, I come back home and then I think, okay, well, I can't really just be on my own all the time because uh, I feel like I'm maybe missing out on something that's important in life. So I'm always like sort of between these two movements, and I keep thinking about, well, Nisargadatta kept saying about how it's important to make friends with solitude, and so I wonder if you could, like, am I correct in thinking he said this, and what is it that he was trying to say through this, and why is it important, and how can it help us, especially somebody like me in this situation? And I'm always torn between these two movements, if you like, which is bad.
Well,
I don't know if it's bad, but
I don't know if he said it, but I wouldn't be surprised he said it, because in general terms, it's an accurate concept, I think, in terms of seeking. So solitude, silence, they're interchangeable, I think. We need to make friends with silence as well as solitude. And that really means that we, as part of our seeking for our completeness out there, and as part of our inherent uncomfortableness that comes from the fact that the doership identity has formed and is in place, that uncomfortableness drives our habits. And so that uncomfortableness of self we don't like sitting with the uncomfortableness of self. So we're continually covering it up and looking for things that will satisfy this, the self that is seeking pleasure. And so silence tends to be something, if you, I was thinking this at the beginning when I was just sitting there, not saying very much, is that silence can be uncomfortable for people. If you sit in a car and don't say anything, you can sometimes feel the sort of tension that is building, because the other person is, who knows what's going around in their head. They might think that you're angry with them, that you're bored, or it can create a space where they feel their own uncomfortableness, their own doubt, right? Self-doubt. And so they'll talk to fill in the silence. And so if we look at it like that, the talking it's not really to fill in the silence, it's to cover up the uncomfortableness. So silence can show up, or can allow our uncomfortableness to bubble to the surface. Whereas when we're talking and when we're doing a lot of things, it gets pushed down to some extent. It's not like it's a complete solution, but that's why meditation can be hard for someone, because it means sitting with yourself for extended periods of time. And solitude versus socializing is sort of similar. We will go out, and if we're with people and engaging, we're doing something, and so you don't have to sit with yourself on your own. And so sitting with yourself on your own can be uncomfortable for someone, because they sort of feel like they're missing out, like they're not appreciated, or that they don't have friends, or they don't have that relationship that they would like to have. And so solitude creates the potential for a whole lot of thinking about inadequacy, thinking about what we don't have, which is all based on the idea that my happiness will come from out there. There comes a point when silence and solitude shifts from being something that is uncomfortable to something that is almost craved, because it is the place, so silence and solitude is not only the place where we get to, in either way we get to be with ourself, and it depends what self is active. If the doership, attachment to outcome self is active, we get to be with ourself and it's uncomfortable. If that has fallen away and the self-contented self is there, then we get to be with that self, and it's nourishing. It feels like this is what I really want. And so when you go out with your friends, if you've said yes to an invitation that you didn't really feel like saying yes to, but you said yes from a should and a shouldn't, then very quickly you'll be there and you'll think, I don't really want to be here. I'd much rather be at home. That doesn't mean sitting there with your eyes closed with yourself, but it means just in your own space. And so then if you do go home and then you have this feeling, well, but I can't, surely I can't be on my own all the time, then there's something coming in, some doubt, because when solitude is presenting as home, the doubt of, but I'm missing out, or that gets eradicated in a way, because it's like, oh, this is it.
Yeah.
So I think the movement towards silence and solitude is important, and it is where we get to appreciate the self, which means we don't need other things. But I think there is also, at that point, once we've settled in there, then there is an appreciation for company, maybe not in the same way as before, as in we don't engage with it or we don't need it in the same way. But even someone who's fine with their own solitude and silence, I think they would, like I would say, I prefer being on my own a lot of the time, but I wouldn't want to be alone all of the time. If I had to be, it would be okay. If there was no one else alive, then I think I would be okay on my own. But I'm grateful for the fact that once a week or whatever, I can say hello to someone and have a meal with someone. And my girlfriend as well is here. But I mean friends and what have you. So so there you go. That's my thought on solitude and silence.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate everything you say.
You're very
You do
welcome.
for us. Thank you.
Arena.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Excellent. And you?
I'm good, thanks. Thank you. First, I just want to thank you for, I want to thank life for me allowing me to bump into you, because you've made life so much different for me in such a good way. I never thought there could be so much less suffering than there used to be. So,
Great.
very grateful for that.
Nice to hear.
The question I had today, I feel like sometimes I'm having trouble. There's a blurriness in the lines between judgment and discernment.
Mm-hmm.
And seems like sometimes it used to be easier to notice it because the suffering was stronger. So I could definitely tell, okay, this is discernment, this is judgment. Lately, what I'm noticing, especially if there is a interaction or a circumstance when maybe I'm interacting with somebody where the sense of doership with the other person is significant. It's strong. A lot that becomes super evident in the circumstance, and almost it feels like maybe I'm rationalizing and trying to say, okay, well, this is me still just discerning it. However, there is a element like the engagement or the there's a certain level of amplification of like how much I'm interested in this information.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So then the question is like, well, then I keep on thinking like, well, but I don't suffer. But then the question comes, but who is so interested in like ranking this like levels of where this person is, where I'm at. So I guess it feels like almost there is a layer there of suffering that is showing up. And I just thought maybe you speaking about it can maybe bring some more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, there's two concepts that are the same in principle, which is this one, where there is a distinction made between judgment and discernment. And in the same way, there is the concept of the biological reaction versus the psychological reaction. And those distinctions, conceptual distinctions, are very important because if we don't have them, we may find ourselves looking at biological responses and thinking they are psychological responses, and we may find ourselves looking at discernment, thinking it is judgment. And if in fact it is discernment, and if in fact it is a biological response, then we don't want to mix the biological response, which could be, let's say, anger, a biological response of anger, and think that it is blame, which is a psychological response of blame. And so when we bring in that concept, it could be very easy that someone then starts labeling the blame that might be happening and saying, oh, this is just a biological response of anger. So that's the danger with introducing that distinction, is that we can end up putting the judgment and the blame into the discernment or the anger category. So that's the danger with the concept. And so someone might say, well, don't introduce the concept and then that won't happen. The problem, if we don't introduce a problem, is that concept, is that we can then think that biological anger is something that needs to end. And we might also think that discernment is something that needs to end. So it's important for the distinction to be made, and then it's important for us to ensure that we're not heaping one of the other into the wrong category. And so I guess that's what your question is. So to clarify for people listening, discernment would mean, so judgment, our judgment usually means anything that we deem to be bad, not good, we will, with the belief in doership, as soon as we label something as there we go. We had a. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Good. 1 second. Let me just put one of these foam windbreaks on. Okay. Our tendency to judge is, as soon as we label anyone doing something that is not ideal, our judgment kicks in and says, you're not doing something ideal, and you're the doer, and you shouldn't do that, and you have to, as the doer, not do that. You have to do it my way, which is according to what is good or what is ideal. And so the movement given in a teaching sometimes is to say there is no such thing as good or bad. There is no such thing as pleasure or pain. All of those are just your labels, and it just is what is. And so there's a way of, there's a validity in seeing life that way. It just is. It's not good or bad. It just is. So if a car is speeding through a school zone at 80 miles an hour when it's meant to be doing 30 miles an hour, we could just go, it just is what it is. It's not good or bad. It just is what it is. And that means our capacity to judge the driver is inhibited because we haven't labeled that as bad. And so the judgment doesn't kick in. So that's useful. The problem is we end up becoming a little bit disarmed in a way, or what's the word? Some of our faculties get disabled for a while, and that is the faculty of discernment. And at some point that needs to come in, which allows us to discern something without our judgment jumping in. And so that means that, for me, if we bring in this thing of a relative benchmark, which says according to safe driving or safe standards, that is bad. So relative to safe driving at 80 miles an hour, that is bad. So we can say that guy is driving too fast. If we go to the it is what it is, which is a useful place to be, we need to do that for a while. That needs to be there first. If we go to it is what it is, then we end up becoming a bit impotent on a certain level, is that we can't say to someone, hey, your driving is irresponsible, frankly. I've seen you going through the school zone at 80 miles an hour. Can you keep it in mind that that's just not on? Now, can I say that to someone? Yes, I can say that because I know I'm saying it relative to safety standards, for example, or relative to what I would like, as opposed to thinking that that is how life should be. So at the same time as saying relative to safety standards, he's driving too fast, I also know, but life is going to turn out one way, and so it's destiny for him to be driving that fast. So it means I'm not impotent on a flow of life level, but I'm not going to get involved psychologically to the point which means where I'm continually thinking about it and whether he does what I want or not. There's a capacity to let it go, because I understand that beyond the biological, beyond the circumstance, there is the attitude that it is all destiny. So the discernment can be, that person is eating way too much sugar. But we don't want it to turn into a judgment, which is they shouldn't eat that much sugar. As in, so once again, we can say they shouldn't, we can say they shouldn't relative to their health. But we also need to be able to say, but their health is their business / God's business, not my business. So I can only say you shouldn't relative to, health standards, but ultimately it is their business and God's business. So if you're judging, you can't let go. If you're discerning, you can let go. You can let it be, even if they're doing what is not ideal. So it's very likely that you've identified, and so I would suggest that you already know the issue. We tend to intuitively have a sense. There is something that, so who is interested in pointing out that, because at some point you don't even say you're eating too much sugar. You might say something when it comes down to the health, the safety of kids and whatever. There's a good reason for that, and you could say that they're eating too much sugar. But once you see they just keep doing it, and you've given the information, and that's it, then you remain silent. So if you're not remaining silent after having, and it's a habit, you might see it's a habit that's saying I'm better than them because whatever. And so that's it. It's not your doing, it's how we function. And so if your awareness is on that, then you might say, hey, let me stop saying it's discernment and let me recategorize it into a judgment and not feel guilty about it. And that's when it's probably going to dissolve.
Good. Okay. Thank you. So just kind of, if I might just add something. So it almost feels like part of the movement has been just deconstructing everything, every interaction internally, and then when I'm interacting with others. So I feel like it's kind of related, where I'm almost like the self-analysis that's happening in me, then I'm kind of projecting that and working when I'm talking to another person, then I'm seeing blame and guilt. And some of it is just kind of has turned into a habit, which I don't have a problem with, but I feel like it's just a lot of stuff. And especially it cannot be the other, like let's say when I talk with my partner, and sometimes he'll just be like, I don't really care to talk on this level. It's creating pain for him. For me, it's like there's this I'm super interested in seeing all those things. And I'm just wondering, I'm hoping that it's part of a phase that maybe it will kind of fade out, because it's just, it seems to be a problem for people around me that I'm kind of more close to and share my internal life.
I would suspect it is a phase, and it can also be beneficial. There can be a phase where you are essentially using other people as a sounding board for your own understanding, and it's reinforcing what guilt is, what blame is, whatever, and it's necessary for you. And they're, in a way, an unfortunate bystander as they get dragged into what is necessary for you. And at some point, once it stops being necessary for us to, it's sort of like practicing for your exams with someone else, and they don't necessarily want to be practicing with you, but you drag them in. And at some point, when we don't need to keep practicing, that's when we get to see the fact that it doesn't suit others. We might see it doesn't suit others earlier, but because we need to keep practicing, it just keeps happening anyway. And at some point, when we don't need to practice anymore, that's when we can realize, oh, let me not talk about it. And that ends up being more harmonious when it can happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Roger.
You're very welcome. I just realized Raghu, he had his hand up last week. Okay. Let me just say hi to Raghu. Sorry, Ted. We've sort of come to the end of the 2 hours. I'll come to your question next week if you put your hand up first. I said that to Raghu, but I didn't see your hand up till now. Hi, how are you going?
Hi, Roger. Was that for me?
Yeah.
Time for a question. No, thank you. So this starts at like 8 a.m. Eastern, I believe. The satsangs, is that right?
Well, I'm not exactly sure. It started 2 hours ago. How's that?
2 hours ago. Okay. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Sometimes I struggle with the thinking mind versus the working mind, and the idea that life is what it is and it's just an unfolding, so it's a perfect unfolding. But then I find myself in kind of like these situations in life when there's some fixation. For example, I had, just a few examples to throw it out there. I had a kind of a tough situation with my dad for a while, and I did go through EMDR therapy, which was supposed to do the emotional release of the anger I was holding for him. Then I find myself, and that's done, and now I find myself not being engaged at work, and facing the consequence of that, and then being stressed out about it. And that changed by itself. I mean, I found myself in another job and just see myself being more motivated. So one of those situations where I actually did do something about it, like going to therapy. Another one, it just went on and on for almost a year, and it changed. The situation changed. And so I see both of these kind of, and there are a number of other things also about like not feeling like I have enough bandwidth, emotional bandwidth to connect people at times, actually a lot of times. So this is where I guess my thinking mind kicks in, is life is as it is. And at the same time, there are certain, situations that kind of adds more conditioning to the working mind, which in turn, I guess, reduces the fixation on certain things that actually engage my thinking mind again. So by just putting myself in some certain situations and allowing new conditioning to work on my working mind, I can see that my thinking mind actually, I guess, so to say, eases off. But it in turn engages my thinking mind, because every time there's a situation, there's a part of me which feels like it actually evokes my doership. Am I being clear so far? I know yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that the doership. So let's be clear: the thinking mind is the doership and attachment to outcome, and it's psychological. It's an attitude to what is happening, an attitude of guilt, of blame, of pride, of worry and anxiety, of fear, of expectation, of attachment to things turning out a certain way, and feeling defined by outcomes. Being very involved, essentially, in life, not letting life flow. And making decisions, let's say, to go to therapy or to change something, doesn't mean that you're in the thinking mind. Is that one of your conclusions? That the
yeah, as in that I guess the reason I'm saying that it engages my thinking mind is that in every situation in life, there is a part of my mind that is like, okay, how can I change this conditioning, so to say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that doesn't have to be the thinking mind. That can be the working mind, because, all the time in life we're faced with problems, and on a circumstantial problem, and we need to find answers to the circumstantial problem, and that requires an assessment, an analysis, a deduction, conclusion process, and that means change. How do I change it? How do I fix the problem? Means change, right? And so the thinking mind kicks in when we insist on change. We insist on the solution, there being a good solution to our problem-solving process. So wanting a good solution in and of itself is not part of the thinking mind, and coming up with what might help, what might give the solution, isn't part of the thinking mind. That's all part of the working mind. So the thinking mind is when we feel that there is no option but it being a good solution, that it has to be this way. So essentially, if we can look at a problem and try and solve it, but then leave the outcome up to God, that's the healthiest place. Because often what happens is we end up insisting on the outcome, which means, remember, you're never in control of the outcomes. Do your best. Now, do your best can include the working mind. Do your best, but understand the outcome is not in your control. And so maybe that distinction means, okay, now I can look at a situation, say that is some doership, look at why the doership is kicking in, and you might say, oh, all of that, and even the thought, if this doership can get cut off, that would be ideal. But then leave the outcome, understand the outcome is not in your control, which means if it doesn't get cut off, you're not continually saying, okay, let me address it again and again and again, because it might be destined for that not to get cut off right now. Yeah.
Thank you. There's another area of confusion. I guess maybe it's similar, could be a little different. Is you talk about like should and should not, and that not to make decision with these kind of conceptual ideas of what I should be doing or shouldn't be doing. Could be, for example, could be wanting to go to therapy or not, but could be anything else, right? Mm-hmm. Where there's an outcome or their conceptual ideas of what I should be doing, whether going out with friends or not. And you talk about kind of like checking in with the body to kind of see what feels right. So if you can kind of elaborate a little more. When I think about the body, I also see it as like some of the biological responses. Mm-hmm. So where is that, what is the compass with which the decisions, I guess, lack of a better term, should be unfolding, which is ironical to use, but like, what is it about like body making a decision that is somehow superior?
Yeah, because we look at often our compass that guides us is our shoulds and shouldn'ts, and our shoulds are all of the things that are right, let's say. I have to be a great friend, so I have to say yes to all the invitations. I can't, take time off work. I have to work instead of choosing a less dedicated life path, let's say. Things that we've been informed of by society as to what is right and what is good. And not only informed by society, but by what we think will make people like us. So we have all of these shoulds and shouldn'ts based on what we think will make us most popular or most loved, which we think is where our happiness is to be found. And also in terms of doing, being a doer that achieves things, that gets good results. And so the suggestion of questioning your shoulds and shouldn'ts is to see this, is how much of your movement in life is dictated by what you should and shouldn't do, i.e. from your head, that is not appreciating what your body feels like doing. And so the idea of coming into the body and feeling what you feel like doing is saying, hey, let me let go of my conditioned shoulds and shouldn'ts that are based on a strategy of getting more love and more things, which is the idea that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, which is why we follow a regimented, this is how you live life set of rules, essentially, and see if there is a different way that then makes us feel freer. And so coming into the body means if you don't feel like, doing something, if you don't feel like going out, instead of saying, oh, I should go out, so I'm going to say yes, you start saying, oh, I don't feel like going out. So now the trick is to say no to going out. And so it can be a bit tricky because it can be scary to say no. We might not be very good at it. We might not know how to say no. But if you start doing it and you become better at it and maybe even find a way of being as nice as you can in saying no, and realizing that you stay home when you're tired, let's say, your body takes this, not only your body and your whole system says, oh, what a relief, and realizes it can follow a different beat, follow a different set of rules, essentially, which are now rules that are not written down rules, but, oh, I'm taking my own guidance from what my body feels like doing. And obviously, you can see where this can be problematic, because our body could tell us to do a lot of things that are not ultimately very good for us. And so there's this refining process that happens once we drop out of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, because when we're in the shoulds and shouldn'ts, that's all we're aware of. We drop out of them and we start doing what we feel like, and there's a great freedom that comes with that. And inevitably there's a rebalancing that happens there, where it changes over time and becomes a better blend of including an assessment of consequences, let's say. At first, I would suggest forget about the consequences and just do what you feel like. Start with the small things instead of going for the very big decisions, because inevitably, one, that's all we're going to be able to be capable of changing are the smaller things. The bigger ones take time before they get addressed, and it takes the need for us to see the benefits of dropping into a different set of instructions. And once we start to see the benefits of doing things differently for the smaller things, then we end up with more motivation to change the bigger things. Like you might say, hey, I really don't need to be working 60 hours a week, and I am, and who says I should or have to? Who says I have to work 60 hours a week? It might not be 60, it might be 40, and you drop down to 20 hours a week. But that decision might not be the first one that you make.
No, thank you. That's helpful. And stop me if I'm going down the wrong rabbit hole here. But is there a relationship between? So I mean, to kind of take a step back, I guess like with that, the refining process is where, an example of including other into the equation might show up as it unfolds without that kind of should and shouldn't layer operating, I guess, right? Am I on the right path when you said the refinement may happen?
Yeah, well, the refinement can include, because at first when we see there is this potential to do things differently, and we realize that we were in a prison of shoulds and shouldn'ts, there can be a rebellion against that. So, if someone says, "Hey, do you want to come out for whatever, for dinner?" Or previously we might have said yes automatically. Or if someone says, "Can you help me with something?" and you always said yes, to the point where people took advantage of you, let's say. And then we shift out of that, and then someone asks us to do, to help them or whatever. We can become quite abrupt in saying no, because it's sort of like we've found this newfound freedom that is healthier than what the other looked like, because the other wasn't healthy. And so we sort of swing to this other side, the opposite, which is almost like, no, you have no right to ask me to help you. Which is not really true. That someone has a right to ask for help. It's just that how we were before was unhealthy, and so now we swing way to the other side. And the refinement can be where, after a while, we realize, oh, even this, we've swung way to the other side, and there then is a space, for example, where we can find ourselves feeling centered, and I feel like helping people sometimes, rather than almost a conditioned response. No, I can't help you. Because we've swung to the other extreme. And so there can be this this refinement. And also in the way that we say no to people or cancel things. At first we might think we have this entitlement to just cancel something, and then we realize, oh no, if I'm going to cancel, it might be nice to send an explanation, to provide some reasoning, and to do it nicely, to apologize. So that can be some of the refining that comes in. We become more tactful at doing what we feel like, rather than at the beginning we tend to be like a bull in a china shop when we switch from one to the other. This thing about always you're not going to do what the other wants, like what but always consider the other in the decisions you make, which means you make a decision aware of the fact that there are others involved. Others might get affected. Now, being aware that the other is going to be affected doesn't mean you never do anything that disappoints or hurts, or, it doesn't mean you always deliver pleasure to the other. But simply being aware of the other, considering the other in your decision. Simply considering the other in your decision means you've considered the other. You might still come up with a decision that says, sorry, I can't help you, but you've considered them in coming up with that decision. And I think that's all we need to do, is consider the other and still allow us to not deliver what the other wants. Yeah.
So the rabbit hole was really about, like, is there a relationship between the decisions from the body and what feels and the working mind?
Well, I think the working mind is it's functional, and the shoulds and shouldn'ts are psychological. And so if you're going to be working from the working mind, less of the shoulds and shouldn'ts, or no shoulds and shouldn'ts, ultimately needs to be because if you're the working mind and shoulds and shouldn'ts, that's not all the working mind, right? The shoulds and shouldn'ts are the attachment to outcomes. So if you are in the working mind, I would go to the body. But the body also includes, or the working mind, when you go into the body, it doesn't eliminate any thinking. So you can say, oh, I'm tired, and I don't feel like going to work. But then the thought might come up, yes, you're free to not go to work, but there's going to be a consequence. And so you consider the consequence. But that thinking doesn't say there's a consequence, so you have to go to work. That thinking doesn't say, oh, not going to work is not at all an option. The working mind thinking says it is an option for you not to go to work. You can choose anything. But this is the consequence, and then it just weighs the whole thing, and it just lets an organic decision come out instead of one driven from a fear or. So even if you make a decision that says, "Oh, I'm going to go to work because I need the income," that's not necessarily fear. That could be a rational conclusion, but it could also be contaminated by a over attachment to the income. So that's why it becomes a trial and error, and a looking at this process and being aware of the different sorts of thinking, the things I've been speaking about. And it's very much a thing that I suggest you try and start off with the smaller decisions first, especially things about friends asking you to places, to events and functions, and just try, saying no. We often say yes far too easily because we're afraid of saying no. Well, I hope that helped. We've gone over time a little bit, so I apologize for keeping anyone longer than they had hoped. I'll see you next week.